The air on Cottonwood Lane that Tuesday morning was thick with the cloying scent of freshly cut grass and unspoken hostility. It clung to the humid August air, a palpable film. From his mother's porch, Arthur Whitaker watched the two women at the edge of the lawn. Victoria Lang, president of the Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association, stood with her back ramrod straight, a crimson blazer, a slash of authority against the placid green of the neighborhood. Beside her, Denise Keller, chair of the Architectural Control Committee, unspooled a bright yellow measuring tape, its metallic clicks unnervingly loud in the quiet of the cul-de-sac. Victoria made a note on the clipboard she held like a scepter. Her expression was one of intense, dispassionate focus, the kind a biologist might wear while observing a bothersome insect. Denise knelt, her movements precise and officious, and stretched the tape from a small metal stake she'd hammered into the turf to the corner of a weathered, gray-shingled structure at the back of the lot, a garden shed. Arthur felt a slow, heavy beat against his ribs, a controlled drum of rising anger. He had seen this performance before, this ritual of public scrutiny. Neighbors peeked from behind their curtains. Mr. Henderson, pretending to inspect his prize-winning azaleas, was watching from 2 houses down. It was social humiliation, packaged as procedural necessity. He walked down the porch steps, his leather-soled work shoes sinking slightly into the soft lawn. "Good morning, Victoria." "Denise," he said, his voice level and calm. He stopped a respectful 10 feet away, establishing a clear boundary. Victoria looked up, her lips forming a small, controlled smile that never reached the cool gray of her eyes. "Arthur, we're just conducting a routine review, as per the ACC guidelines. A routine review that requires survey stakes and a 50-foot tape." Arthur gestured toward the shed. "That structure has been standing there for 30 years. My father built it. I'm fairly certain it hasn't moved. The covenants require periodic review to ensure ongoing compliance," Denise recited, not looking up from her task. She had a unique talent for speaking in the passive, authoritative voice of a legal document. The setback requirements are quite specific. Arthur knew this was not routine. This was the opening salvo in a war he had hoped to avoid. He glanced back at the house, where he could just see his mother's silhouette in the kitchen window. Eleanor. The sole reason he was here. The reason his heart hammered with a protective fury he had to keep meticulously sheathed. "I see," he said, his tone still mild. "Well, I trust you'll be providing a copy of your report in writing." "Victoria." The question was a subtle challenge, a reminder that her power, however absolute she believed it to be, was bound by the very procedures she wielded as weapons. For a fleeting second, a flicker of irritation crossed her face before the placid mask of presidential authority settled back into place. "Of course." "Arthur," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "everything will be done by the book. We pride ourselves on our transparency." She made another crisp note on her clipboard, the scratch of her pen an act of aggression. The performance was over. With a final, proprietary glance at the shed, she and Denise reeled in their tape, pulled up their stake, and marched back to the sidewalk. Their footsteps a syncopated rhythm of impending conflict. As they moved on to the next house, Arthur remained on the lawn, the impression of the survey stake in the grass a small, dark wound on an otherwise perfect morning. He knew, with the certainty of a man who spent his life reading the fine print of hostile agreements, that this was not about a shed. It was about something far older and far more venomous. Arthur Whitaker was a contracts lawyer, a man who lived in a world of clauses, subclauses, and carefully defined terms. He found comfort in the rigid logic of legal frameworks, in the way a well-drafted document could create order out of the chaos of human ambition. He did not, as a rule, enjoy conflict. He preferred to resolve disputes with quiet negotiation and surgical precision, long before they escalated into open warfare. Which was why the situation at Maple Creek Estates was a particular kind of hell. His mother, Eleanor, was 78 years old, a woman whose life was as deeply rooted in the house on Cottonwood Lane as the ancient oak tree in the backyard. She was proud and, until recently, fiercely independent. But a heart condition had left her fragile, her energy a finite resource that had to be carefully managed. Her cardiologist had been explicit during their last visit. Stress is the enemy, Arthur. Any significant emotional or physical strain could be problematic. That clinical, terrifying word echoed in his mind every time the HOA sent another letter. He and his wife, Sarah, had driven down from the city for the week to help Eleanor, a visit that had now coincided with the HOA's latest escalation. That evening, Sarah sat beside him at his mother's dining room table, her presence a warm, steadying anchor. She was a high school history teacher, a woman who understood the long arc of power struggles better than most. "This isn't about compliance, is it?" she said, looking at the thick, professionally bound book on the table between them, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions of the Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association. "It never is," Arthur murmured, flipping through the pages. His finger traced the lines of legalese, the dense paragraphs that gave Victoria Lang her power. He stopped at Article 8. Section 4. Easements. Here it is. FR 8.4.2. Utility easements. A perpetual easement is hereby reserved over a 10-10-foot wide strip along the rear and a 5-5-foot wide strip along the side interior lot lines of each lot for the installation, operation, and maintenance of utilities. "Does the shed sit on that easement?" Sarah asked. "I don't know. Dad was meticulous. But who knows, after 30 years the language here is the problem," Arthur said, tapping the page. "It grants access for utility maintenance, not architectural oversight. But this language is vague. It could be twisted if someone wanted to." "And Victoria wants to," Sarah finished for him. Victoria Lang had been board president for 6 years, ruling with an iron will and a preternatural gift for procedural obstruction. She had a small, loyal cadre on the board who rubber-stamped her every decision. Her grudge against the Whitaker family was a thing of local legend, though its origins were murky. Some said it was a dispute over a shared property line from years ago. Others whispered it had something to do with business dealings between her husband, a local developer, and Arthur's late father. Whatever its source, it was a cold, patient animosity that had found its perfect weapon in the HOA's governing documents. "This isn't a courtroom, Arthur," Sarah cautioned, sensing the legal machinery already whirring in his mind. "It's a neighborhood. You have to win them over, not just beat her." He knew she was right, but as he stared at the dense, unforgiving text of the CC&Rs, he felt the familiar pull of his professional instincts. This was a contract, and Victoria was in breach of its spirit, if not yet its letter. He would fight this on his terms with documents, facts, and the unassailable logic of the law. The letter arrived 4 days later, exactly as he knew it would. It came not in a standard envelope, but in a stiff, official-looking mailer delivered by certified mail, a tactic designed for maximum intimidation. Arthur had to sign for it at the door, the mail carrier's electronic stylus recording his reluctant acknowledgement. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, her teacup rattling softly in its saucer as she watched him open it. He unfolded the single sheet of heavy bond paper. At the top, the Maple Creek Estates logo, A stylized oak leaf, in an aggressive shade of forest green, presided over the text. Formal notice of violation. Date: August 22, 2023. Property lot: 14, 121, Cottonwood Lane. Owner of record: Eleanor Whitaker. Dear Mrs. Whitaker, this letter serves as formal notice of a violation of the governing documents of the Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association. During a routine inspection conducted by the Architectural Control Committee on August 18, 2023, it was determined that an unapproved auxiliary structure garden shed is situated on your property in breach of the association's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC&Rs. Specifically, the structure is in violation of FERGR 7.3 Architectural Control Requirement for prior written approval for any and all exterior structures. FERGR 8.4.2 Setback and Easement Requirements. Encroachment into the side yard utility easement. Pursuant to the association's enforcement policy, you are hereby required to bring the property into compliance by removing the unapproved structure within 14 days of the date of this notice. Failure to comply by September 5, 2023, will result in the levying of fines in the amount of $100 per day until the violation is cured. The letter was signed with a crisp, authoritative flourish by Victoria Lang, President. Arthur read it twice, a cold anger settling deep in his gut. They were citing a rule, FERGR 7.3 Architectural Control, that had never been enforced for a structure built before the current iteration of the bylaws was even drafted. It was a classic case of selective enforcement. Eleanor's face was pale. They can't be serious. An unapproved structure Robert built that shed the year you started high school. He got all the proper permits from the county. Her voice was thin, reedy. And the easement. Your father had the lot surveyed before he built that shed. He was so careful. He said the deed was clear. She was referencing a memory 30 years old, a piece of family history that had just become a vital piece of evidence. Arthur folded the letter and placed it carefully on the table. The 14-day clock had started ticking. Don't worry, Mom, he said, his voice softer than he felt. This is just the first step. They're trying to scare you. I'll handle it. He would start with diplomacy. He would attend the next board meeting and appeal to reason. But as he looked at the cold, formal notice, he knew that reason would have little to do with the fight to come. This was a battle of wills, and he was just beginning to assemble his arsenal. The monthly board meeting was held in the clubhouse, a sterile, beige room that smelled of industrial-strength carpet cleaner and stale coffee. Arthur sat in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs in the gallery, a slim leather portfolio resting on his lap. He had prepared a calm, logical appeal, complete with copies of the original county building permits for the shed he'd managed to dig up from the municipal archives. He believed, perhaps naively, that a presentation of facts could defuse the situation. The meeting began, as always, with Victoria presiding from the head of a long folding table. She moved through the agenda with ruthless efficiency, minutes from the last meeting, the treasurer's report, a lengthy and self-congratulatory update from the landscaping committee about the installation of drought-resistant perennials near the entrance sign. Finally, she arrived at Homeowner Open Forum. The board now recognizes Arthur Whitaker, she announced, her voice devoid of any warmth. Arthur stood and walked to the small lectern provided for residents. He laid out his documents, took a deep breath, and began. Good evening, members of the board, neighbors. I'm here tonight on behalf of my mother, Eleanor Whitaker, of 121 Cottonwood Lane, regarding a violation notice she received for her garden shed. He spoke for 5 minutes, his tone measured and respectful. He outlined the history of the structure, its 30-year existence without complaint. He presented the county permits from 1993. He explained that his father had been a founding member of the neighborhood and had always taken great care to adhere to all regulations. Given the age of the structure and the fact that it predates many of the current architectural guidelines, we are requesting that the board grant a variance, or grandfather the shed, effectively recognizing its long-standing presence. He concluded, "My mother is in her late 70s, and the stress of this issue, along with the physical and financial burden of removing the structure, would represent a significant hardship." He looked directly at Victoria. "We hope we can resolve this amicably, as neighbors." A tense silence filled the room. Todd, the treasurer, adjusted his glasses and peered at a spreadsheet on his laptop, avoiding eye contact. Denise Keller sat rigid, her hands folded primly on the table. Victoria let the silence stretch for a moment before she spoke, her voice laced with a condescending pity. "Thank you for your presentation. Arthur, the board appreciates your engagement." She paused, letting the patronizing word hang in the air. However, the governing documents are quite clear. A rule is a rule. To grant a variance for one homeowner would set a precedent that could undermine the uniform application of the covenants for everyone. I'm sure, as a lawyer, you understand the importance of uniformity. With all due respect. "Victoria," Arthur countered, keeping his voice steady. "The board has the discretionary power to grant variances, especially in cases of demonstrable hardship or pre-existing conditions. Selective enforcement of a 30-year-old issue is not uniformity. It's targeted harassment." A few murmurs rippled through the small crowd of homeowners in the gallery. Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Your opinion is noted," she said, her voice turning to ice. "The violation stands. The deadline for compliance remains September 5th. The board considers this matter closed for tonight." She banged her gavel, a small, absurdly formal wooden mallet, on the table. "Next item on the agenda." Arthur stood at the lectern, stunned by the sheer, blatant stonewalling. He had been dismissed as if he were a child asking for a later bedtime. He gathered his papers, his hands tight with frustration, and returned to his seat. He had come with facts and reason. He was met with a procedural wall. It was then he understood with absolute clarity this was not a dispute to be resolved. It was a fight to be won. As he sat fuming through the remainder of the meeting, Sarah's words came back to him. "It's a neighborhood. You have to win them over, not just beat her." He looked around at the other homeowners. Most were passive, intimidated. A few, however, met his gaze with a flicker of sympathy. He realized Sarah was right. Victoria's power came from the board, but the board's power ultimately came from the homeowners. If he couldn't win at the table with her, he would have to win in the court of public opinion, right here in the neighborhood she thought she controlled. The strategy was no longer about a simple appeal. It was about building a case. The shift from diplomacy to investigation was immediate. The next morning, Arthur sat at his mother's dining table, his laptop open, the violation notice lying next to it like a declaration of war. He was no longer a son pleading his mother's case. He was a lawyer building a file. His first move was formal and procedural. He drafted a letter to the HOA board, citing the section of the state's Common Interest Development Act that guaranteed homeowners the right to inspect association records. He requested copies of all board meeting minutes, financial statements, and architectural committee decisions for the past 5 years. He sent the request via certified mail, creating a paper trail Victoria could not ignore. While he waited for the HOA's response, he made a call. George Arthur Whitaker, I've got a strange one for you. George Pearsall was a retired county surveyor, a man whose knowledge of property lines, deeds, and easements was encyclopedic. He was 65, grizzled, and had a healthy distrust for any organization run by a committee. Arthur had used him as an expert witness in a complex land use case years ago, and had been impressed by his almost fanatical attention to detail. HOA trouble. George grunted into the phone. Let me guess. They're telling you your fence is 3 inches over a line that hasn't been properly marked since the Truman administration. Close, Arthur said with a wry smile. A 30-year-old shed and a utility easement. They're claiming it's an encroachment. My mother swears my father had it surveyed before he built. They always do, George said. The old-timers were careful. Tell you what, I'll come out tomorrow. I'll bring the transit and pull the original plat map from the county recorder's office. We'll see what the official record says. These HOAs, they love to wave around their own little maps. But the county's record is the only one that holds up in court. A week later, a thick manila envelope arrived from the HOA's management company. Inside were the requested documents, or, rather, parts of them. Arthur spread the meeting minutes across the table. They were a sea of black redactions. Entire paragraphs and resolutions were obscured by thick, dark lines, rendering them useless. Sarah peered over his shoulder. What are they hiding? Arthur's finger stopped on the minutes from a meeting dated March 15th of that year. A heading read, New Business. Underneath it, a single line was visible. Discussion of Lot 14. Development proposals. The entire paragraph that followed was blacked out. Lot 14. His mother's property. I don't know, he said slowly, a cold knot forming in his stomach. But I'm going to find out. The next day, George arrived, his truck laden with tripods, scopes, and rolled-up maps. He spent the morning walking the property, taking measurements with methodical precision. Afterward, he joined Arthur at the dining table, spreading out a large, crisp copy of the official county plat map. Well, son, George began, tapping a spot on the map with a calloused finger. Your mother's memory is sharp as a tack. He pointed to the precise location of the shed. According to the official survey, the structure sits 0.75 inches inside your mother's property line. It's tight, but it's clear. It does not encroach on the neighbor's lot. What about the easement? Arthur asked. Ah, the easement, George said, a twinkle in his eye. That's the interesting part. He explained that the 5-foot utility easement was indeed recorded, but the language in the county deed was specific. It granted the utility company the right of access for maintenance. It said nothing about prohibiting structures. An electric company could, in theory, ask for the shed to be moved if they needed to dig a trench, but it did not grant the HOA architectural control over that strip of land. They're misinterpreting their own authority. Arthur breathed. They're using the existence of the easement as a pretext for an architectural violation. That's the legal argument. George agreed. But I don't think that's the real story. He slid another folder across the table. It's never about the shed. Son, follow the money. Inside the folder were public records from the county tax assessor and recorder's office. George had, on his own initiative, looked into the ownership of the surrounding properties. The documents showed that the 2 lots immediately adjacent to Eleanor's had been purchased within the last 6 months. The buyer was a shell corporation named Creekview Holdings, LLC. Took me about 10 minutes to pierce that veil, George said proudly. The registered agent for Creekview Holdings is a law firm, and the primary officer listed on the corporate filing is one Marcus Lang, Victoria's husband. The final document was a printout from the city planning department. It was a preliminary application for commercial rezoning for a parcel of land that included the 2 lots Marcus Lang had purchased. A 4th lot he had a pending offer on, and one glaring hole in the middle of the proposed development. Lot 14, Eleanor Whitaker's property. Arthur stared at the map, the redacted minutes flashing in his mind. Lot 14. Development proposals. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't about a shed. It wasn't about rules or setbacks, or the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. It was a coordinated, systematic campaign to harass his mother, to bury her in fines and legal threats until she was forced to sell the one piece of land Victoria's husband needed to complete his profitable puzzle. The polite mask of community governance had been ripped away, revealing the rapacious greed beneath. This was no longer just a fight. It was a hunt. The notice of hearing arrived, as expected, via certified mail. It was a formal summons for Eleanor to appear before the board to adjudicate the unresolved violation. The tone was cold, clinical, and utterly devoid of any pretense of neighborly resolution. Arthur knew the outcome was preordained, but procedure had to be followed. The hearing was a sham, a piece of performative justice staged in the soulless clubhouse. Arthur presented his evidence with the precision of a surgeon, the official county survey proving the shed was on his mother's property, the legal interpretation of the utility easement that demonstrated the HOA was overreaching. He laid the documents on the table for the board to see. Victoria glanced at them dismissively. "Thank you, Arthur. The board has consulted its own experts." She did not specify who these experts were. After careful consideration, the board finds that the violation persists. The structure remains unapproved under Waiver 7.3 of the covenants. She had simply shifted her justification. When the easement argument was disproven, she fell back on the unapproved structure clause, ignoring the fact that it was 30 years old. It was a textbook example of moving the goalposts. The board voted unanimously, 3-0. As 2 members were conveniently absent to find Eleanor in violation, the fines of $100 per day began immediately, retroactive to the original deadline. 2 weeks later, the final shoe dropped. A thick envelope from the HOA's law firm contained a notice of intent to place a lien. It stated that if the accrued fines and newly added legal fees, now totaling over $4,000, were not paid within 30 days, the association would place a lien on Eleanor's property. A lien was a cloud on the title, the first legal step toward foreclosure. It was the HOA's ultimate weapon. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the letter. The stress was taking its toll. Her blood pressure was up, and Arthur could see the exhaustion etched around her eyes. The doctor's warning echoed in his ears. Just as he was plotting his next legal move, a new front opened in Victoria's war. He saw the violation notice taped to the front door of Mrs. Patterson, his mother's elderly neighbor. He walked over to find the woman, a frail but spirited widow of 85, staring at the paper in disbelief. "They're telling me my wheelchair ramp is a violation of aesthetic standards," she said, her voice trembling with indignation. "This ramp is how I get out of my own house. It was approved by the county for ADA compliance." The notice was almost identical to his mother's, citing a vague clause about maintaining the architectural harmony of the community. It was another transparently cruel and targeted attack. This was the moment that crystallized the moral stakes of the conflict. He was fighting for his mother, but the battle was clearly larger than one shed on one lot. Victoria was using the HOA as a cudgel to intimidate and displace any resident who stood in the way of her personal or financial ambitions. The next day, Arthur received a call from the HOA's attorney, a man named Stephen Gale. His tone was smooth, conciliatory. "Arthur, my client is prepared to be reasonable," Gale said. Victoria is willing to instruct the board to grant a permanent variance for your mother's shed and waive all fines. A full resolution. Arthur was suspicious. What's the catch? No catch, Gail replied. Too quickly. We just asked that. In the spirit of community harmony, you withdraw your various records requests and agree that this resolves all outstanding issues between Mrs. Whitaker and the association. The meaning was clear. They would drop his mother's case if he stayed silent about the larger pattern of abuse. If he abandoned Mrs. Patterson. If he stopped digging into the Lang development deal. They were trying to buy his silence, to isolate their victims one by one. He discussed it with Sarah that night. The offer was a guaranteed victory for his mother. It would end the stress that was actively damaging her health. It was the safe, logical choice. They're offering you an exit ramp. Arthur, Sarah said softly, but they're asking you to leave Mrs. Patterson on the side of the road. He looked at the mountain of evidence he had gathered on the dining table, the maps, the corporate filings, the redacted minutes. He thought of his father's integrity, of his mother's quiet strength, of Mrs. Patterson's defiant stand for her own mobility. Taking the deal would save his mother, but it would sacrifice his principles. It would allow the rot in Maple Creek to fester, to claim another victim later. I'm not taking it, he said, the decision settling in his soul with the weight of absolute certainty. I'm not just fighting for a shed anymore. I'm fighting for the whole neighborhood. He knew then what he had to do. The annual homeowners meeting was in 2 weeks. It was the one meeting Victoria couldn't completely control, where the agenda allowed for an open forum. He would have 5 minutes. 5 minutes to expose everything. The annual homeowners meeting was held not in the small clubhouse, but in the gymnasium of the local middle school to accommodate the larger crowd. The air was stuffy, smelling of floor wax and anxious anticipation. Over 100 homeowners sat in rows of metal folding chairs, a far greater turnout than usual. Word had spread. Something was going to happen. Arthur sat in the third row between Sarah and his mother. Mrs. Patterson was 2 seats down, her jaw set with a quiet determination. He had registered for a 5-minute speaking slot during the open forum, and his name was 4th on the list. In his briefcase was a USB drive containing a meticulously organized presentation. Victoria and the board sat at a long table on the stage, looking out at the crowd with strained smiles. Victoria opened the meeting, her voice bright and confident as she ran through a summary of the year's accomplishments, the new perennials, a successful pool season, a fiscally responsible budget. It was a masterclass in projecting normalcy, while a rebellion simmered just below the surface. Finally, the time came. We will now move to the homeowner open forum, the moderator announced. Each speaker will have a strict 5-minute limit. First up is Arthur Whitaker. As Arthur walked to the podium, a low murmur went through the crowd. He plugged the USB drive into the provided laptop, and the first slide of his presentation appeared on the large screen behind the board. It was a simple title, transparency, and accountability in Maple Creek. He began, his voice calm and clear, amplified by the microphone. Good evening, everyone. Before I begin my presentation, I feel it is my duty to inform the community of an offer I received last week from the board's legal counsel. He looked directly at Victoria, whose smile faltered. I was offered a private deal. The board would drop its case against my mother's property and waive all fines. If I agreed to cease all further inquiries into the association's business and remain silent about the violation notice recently issued to my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, for her medically necessary wheelchair ramp. A collective gasp went through the gymnasium. He had just publicly refused the settlement, turning their weapon of isolation against them. I refused that offer, Arthur stated simply. Because this is not just about one shed or one ramp. This is about the integrity of our community and the fiduciary duty of those we elect to lead it. The moderator nervously tapped his watch. 4 minutes. Mr. Whitaker. Arthur clicked to the next slide. A photo of his mother's shed appeared on the screen. The board has spent thousands of our dollars in legal fees pursuing this violation. First, they claimed it encroached on a utility easement. Click. The next slide showed the official county plat map, with the property lines and easement clearly marked in red. However, as the official county survey confirms, the structure sits fully on private property and is compliant with the recorded easement. I have copies of this survey for every homeowner. He gestured to a stack of papers on the table, which Sarah began to distribute. 3 minutes, the moderator warned. When that justification failed, Arthur continued, his voice rising with controlled intensity. The board shifted its argument to a violation of FAR 7.3, a rule regarding prior approval for structures. A rule they are attempting to apply retroactively to a shed that has stood for 30 years. Click. The next slide was a scanned image of the redacted minutes from the March 15th board meeting. The blacked-out paragraph about Lot 14 development proposals highlighted. For weeks, I have wondered what the board was hiding in their executive session minutes. Why were discussions about my mother's specific lot redacted? Click. The screen changed to show the same page, but this time, unredacted. A former, disillusioned board member, disgusted by Victoria's tactics, had anonymously mailed Arthur the complete version. The revealed text was damning. V. Lang reported that initial contact with owner of Lot 14 was unsuccessful. Board discussed escalating enforcement of existing covenants to encourage a resolution. M. Lang of Lang Development has expressed continued interest in the parcel to complete the Creekview commercial assemblage. The room erupted in a chorus of angry shouts. Victoria's face went white. 1 minute. This was never about a shed, Arthur declared, his voice cutting through the noise. This was about a conflict of interest. Click. The final slide appeared. It was a map of the neighborhood, showing the lots owned by Lang Development in blue, the lot with a pending offer in yellow, and his mother's Lot 14, a defiant red island in the middle. This has been a coordinated effort to use our association's power to devalue a resident's property to benefit the financial interests of the board president's husband. This is not governance. It is corruption. The 5-minute timer buzzed, its shrill sound signaling the end of his time. Arthur stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding. The gymnasium was filled with a stunned, furious silence. He had laid out the facts, connected the dots, and exposed the rot at the core of their HOA. The neighborhood now knew the truth. In the electric silence that followed the buzzer, every eye in the gymnasium was fixed on the stage. Victoria Lang sat frozen, her face a mask of disbelief. The carefully constructed world of her authority had been dismantled, piece by piece, in 5 methodical minutes. Before she or the stunned moderator could regain control, a man stood up from the middle of the crowd. It was Mr. Henderson, the quiet resident who tended his azaleas. His voice, though trembling slightly, was firm and clear. "I'd like to make a motion," he said, addressing not the board, but his fellow homeowners. "I move that this assembly of homeowners direct the board to immediately freeze all fines and cease any and all legal actions against Lot 14 property of Eleanor Whitaker and Lot 22 property of Mrs. Patterson." "Second," a woman shouted from the back. The moderator, flustered, looked at Victoria, who remained silent, seemingly unable to process the mutiny. "There is a motion on the floor." The moderator stammered. "All in favor say, aye." A deafening roar of AYE filled the gymnasium. All opposed. Silence. Even Denise and Todd on the stage did not dare raise their voices. "The motion carries," the moderator said weakly. Another homeowner was already on her feet. "I make a motion that the homeowners commission a full, independent financial audit of the association's books for the past 5 years, to be conducted by a firm with no prior connection to the board or its members." Second came the immediate reply. The vote was another overwhelming, thunderous aye. Todd, the treasurer, began to sweat profusely, shuffling papers as if they might offer him some escape. Then, a third resident stood, a young lawyer who had recently moved into the neighborhood, pursuant to our bylaws. Article 4, Section 2, which allows for the removal of directors by a majority vote of the membership. I hereby move to initiate a formal recall petition for the entire board of directors, effective immediately. The room exploded. This was the final, decisive blow. The motion was seconded by a dozen voices at once. When the vote was called, nearly every hand in the room shot into the air. The motion passed with a majority so vast it was essentially unanimous. Victoria finally found her voice. She stood up, gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "This is out of order," she cried, her voice shrill. "You cannot. This meeting is not the proper venue." But it was too late. Her power had evaporated. The homeowners were no longer listening to her. They were talking to each other, a current of shared purpose and liberation arcing through the room. The moderator, seeing the tide had irrevocably turned, declared the open forum closed and the official business of the meeting concluded. The residents had taken back their association. In the ensuing chaos, as people crowded around Arthur to shake his hand and clap him on the back, he saw Victoria have a brief, quiet moment of deflation. Her shoulders slumped, the rigid posture crumbling as the full weight of her public humiliation landed. Then, just as quickly, the anger returned. She gathered her things with sharp, jerky movements, shot Arthur a look of pure venom, and stormed off the stage, her loyal but doomed board members scrambling behind her. Her reign was over. The recall was swift and decisive. Within a month, Victoria and her entire board were formally removed from their positions. A special election was held, and a new, resident-led board was seated, with Mr. Henderson serving as the interim president. Their first official act was to terminate the contract with the HOA's management company, which had enabled Victoria's abuses for years. Arthur, at the new board's request, volunteered his time to help them navigate the transition. He led a committee tasked with drafting a homeowner's Bill of Rights, a series of amendments to the bylaws designed to ensure transparency, protect due process, and severely limit the board's ability to selectively enforce rules or engage in conflicts of interest. The amendments passed with a 98% approval from the community. The independent audit revealed the extent of the financial misconduct, and the findings were turned over to the proper authorities. The Langs, both Victoria and her husband, were soon facing a host of legal troubles that had nothing to do with the HOA. Life on Cottonwood Lane slowly returned to a new, better normal. The fear that had permeated the neighborhood was gone, replaced by a sense of shared ownership and community. Mrs. Patterson's wheelchair ramp was officially approved, and a plaque celebrating her resilience was placed in the community garden. Months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Arthur was helping his mother clean out the old roll-top desk that had belonged to his father. Eleanor's health had improved dramatically now that the stress was gone. Her laughter once again filled the house, a sound Arthur realized he had desperately missed. In a dusty back drawer, beneath old tax returns and expired warranties, He found a thick file folder labeled simply, Maple Creek, Dev, Com, 1992. "I remember this," Eleanor said, peering at it. "Your father was the first head of the development committee. Before the HOA was even formally incorporated. He spent so much time on it." Curious, Arthur opened the folder. Inside were yellowing architectural plans, letters, and meeting notes from the neighborhood's earliest days. Tucked within was a formal letter, written on his father's old letterhead. It was addressed to a young, ambitious developer named Marcus Lang. The letter, signed by Robert Whitaker as committee chairman, was a formal rejection of a proposal Mr. Lang had submitted. Arthur's father had written in firm, unequivocal terms about his concerns over unethical rezoning tactics, a disregard for existing green spaces, and what he called a clear and troubling conflict of interest regarding the proposed contractor. Arthur leaned back in his chair, the letter resting in his hands. He read it again, the pieces of a 30-year-old puzzle clicking silently into place. This entire vendetta, the years of animosity, the petty violations, the relentless, cruel campaign against his mother hadn't started with a property line or a neighborhood dispute. It had started here. In this letter, his father had blocked a shady deal, costing a young Marcus and Victoria Lang a significant payday. He had stood for principle over profit. And Victoria had never forgotten. For 3 decades, she had harbored a grudge, waiting for the power to exact her revenge on the family who had thwarted her ambitions. The fight over the shed wasn't about clearing the way for a new development. It was about settling an old score. It was personal. A quiet, generational war that had finally been fought and won on the battlefield of her own making. He looked over at his mother, who was humming softly as she polished a silver frame. She was safe. The neighborhood was safe. His father's legacy of integrity had, in the end, been protected.